All right. Hi, everyone. I am back, and we're going to see here if this works. Mollie and Zack from the Minnesota Brain Injury Alliance should be joining us very shortly, and we'll get going with today's webinar. Give me 1 second to see if I can get them added. All right. All right, we're just waiting then for Mollie and Zack to join us. And okay, Zack, can you request? It's totally different. The update, the iOS update, nothing is quite the same here. There we go. Here we go. I got Mollie's. So I think they should be here any second. It looks like we're adding them. There we go. Oh, the iOS update. And now nothing is where it used to be.
Yep.
All right. All right, Joe says it looks good here. You can see all of us.
There we go.
All right, so I have the link in the description with the link to today's PDF. If you guys would like to follow along or have that for future reference. But today we are talking about accommodations at the voting booth. Mollie and Zack, why don't you guys just give a quick intro to who you guys are in case someone hasn't watched any of our webinars yet.
Sure, sounds good. So my name is Mollie Clark. I'm a public policy associate and grassroots lobbyist at the Minnesota Brain Injury Alliance. So the main role in my job is to organize our citizen advocates. They're our group of people with brain injury or stroke who get involved on a grassroots level to advocate for systems to be improved, to help other people with brain injury and stroke. So I help coordinate a Citizen Advocate Academy, lead Tuesdays at the Capitol, stuff like that. And I'm joined here by my colleague, Zack.
Hi, I'm Zack Eichten. I'm the direct lobbyist at the Minnesota Brain Injury Alliance, which means my primary role is to interface directly with legislators, organize meetings and face-to-faces so that our network of citizen advocates are able to have a better connection with their legislators and be more effective in getting policies that we care about passed.
Perfect.
Yeah.
And I just pinned the link as well. So anyone's watching this later, I pinned the link to the handout as well.
Perfect.
So I guess we can just kind of jump right into today's topic. Whichever one of you is going to go first.
Yeah, so today's topic, we're going to be talking about accommodations while voting because we know that disability should not be a reason to not engage civically. People with disabilities should be empowered to vote. And we're here to sort of go over a little bit of what that means for folks with TBI. And if there are any questions about anything we say throughout this, feel free to drop a comment in the comments box. We'll be monitoring those throughout the webinar. So make sure to ask your questions when you have them, and we'll do our best to address them right away. And if you're watching on the recording, we'll monitor those comments afterwards. So if you have them, drop a comment right there, and we'll be looking for those as well.
For sure.
So to start off, we're going to talk about sort of the basis for accommodations while voting, and that's the Americans with Disabilities Act, so the ADA. And the ADA was passed in 1990 by, who was it, Mollie?
Senator Tom Harkin.
And how do you know that, Mollie?
I used to work for him.
Yes. So Mollie used to work for Senator Harkin, chief author of the ADA, and something that I'm sure we're all extremely grateful for, just because of the sort of accessibility and accommodations that were put into law by the ADA. So the ADA covers a whole host of topics that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, including employment, public services operated by private businesses, telecommunications, transportation, education. It covers a whole just host of policies that all fit into this category of disability and the lives that people lead with disabilities, making sure that it's as equitable as it can be. And then in 2002, on top of that, the Help America Vote Act was passed to help create more accessible ways to vote, including for non-physical disabilities. So that's your TBI and any other disability that isn't visual, like you can't see it right off the bat, those sort of invisible disabilities. It covers all of that and makes voting a key component of citizenship for folks with disabilities, and trying to make that a more easy process and more inclusive process to accommodate for those disabilities.
Yeah, so to kind of jump off of that, we're going to be talking about how the ADA and the Help America Vote Act translate to what's happening when you're at the polls. So the ADA is obviously like a wonderful piece of legislation, but one error is that it's focused primarily on people with mobility problems. So the ADA is what requires things like ramps to businesses. It requires cut curbs on sidewalks. But for people with TBI, a lot of times the problem is bigger than just a mobility issue. So even if you do use a wheelchair, you still may have difficulty reading, filling out, or understanding the ballot. And so the accessibility things we're going to talk about today are a combination of mobility geared accessibility as well as accessibility for people who maybe have other troubles, with executive function, troubles with vision or hearing. So the Government Accountability Office estimated in 2008 that only 27% of polling places were accessible. And that's a really, really bad thing, right? And unfortunately, that means that a lot of people with disabilities have historically felt like they couldn't go to the polling place to vote. Luckily, we're in a period of time where a lot of that is changing. There are legal mandates as well as kind of public pushes to make voting in polling places more accessible. And the rise of no excuse early absentee balloting has made it a lot easier for people with disabilities to vote. So like we talked about last time, you are always able to vote early by mail vote early or by mail in Minnesota. It varies a little bit state by state, but that is an option if you want to look it up. So fortunately, there are a number of legally protected rights that people with disabilities are entitled to when they're voting, to make sure that you can get to the polling place and cast your ballot in a private and independent way. That's really their goal, is to try and make it as close to the experience that other folks are having as possible. So one thing is that polling places are required to have accessible parking and drop-off locations, which means that if you use a lift, if you use any sort of wheelchair accessibility equipment, there has to be space for you to get that out of your vehicle and to exit safely. If there is not, however, they are required to provide curbside voting. So they'll have signs up that provide you some sort of way to alert the people inside. Usually it's a doorbell or some other sort of notification device. And they'll come to you. They'll send an election judge, one from each party, and you'll be able to cast your ballot in your car. A lot of times that's offered even if there are ramps and accessible parking spots available. But if you can't safely get out of your car and into the building, then they are legally required to provide curbside voting. They can't just say, "Oh, straight out of luck, you can't vote." That's not legal. The other thing is when a federal election is taking place, so like the elections that are coming up in November are a federal election, you're voting for some federal offices. Every polling place is required to have at least one accessible voting machine. And those can look a couple different ways. We were really lucky to have in one of our Citizen Advocate Academies a member from our district or from our county come in and show us the accessible polling places for the county where our MNBIA offices are. But even if they look a little bit different, even if they function a little bit different, all of your election judges, the people who oversee election day, are trained in how to use those machines and are legally mandated to let you use those if you ask to. So those can help you if you have hearing problems, vision problems. They often come with headsets, and you can scroll through a list of options and select options. And they're pretty cool to use, and they can really increase independence when voting. If you're not interested in doing that, you are allowed to ask for help filling out your ballot, and you can ask for help either from a election judge, and then like with curbside voting, they'll usually have somebody from each party come and join you and supervise and help you fill out your ballot. So you can have them read your ballot to you. You can have them, fill in the dots if you can read but have trouble with fine motor skills, all of that. And so you can ask for the election judge to help you fill out your ballot. And if you're not comfortable with that, you can actually bring a caregiver, a loved one, a friend, somebody to help you fill out your ballot. There are a couple more rules about that. In some states, you're not allowed to have folks from a political party or folks who there are a couple of weird rules about that. So if you plan to have a loved one vote with you, just double check those rules. But that's a really good option for people who maybe aren't comfortable talking to a stranger or communicating with a stranger about who they want to vote for. You're also allowed to have your service animal with you. The one distinction is that if you have a support animal, so an emotional support animal, basically an unlicensed animal, you are not allowed to bring them with you into the polling place. But if you have a seeing eye dog, if you have a dog for epilepsy, if they're officially registered with the state as a service animal, you are allowed to bring them with you to vote. They're essential for your health and well-being. They're going to be there too, right? They can't cast their own ballot because unfortunately dogs don't have hands. But
yeah,
you can bring them along.
That's the only reason, though.
That's the only reason. They don't have hands. But yeah, so you can bring your service animal along. The other thing that we like to throw out, this isn't specifically tied to people with disabilities, but it's something that a lot of people don't know, is you're allowed to bring a sample ballot or any form of notes to the polls with you. And so even when I vote, I come with a sheet of all the folks I want to vote for. Mm-hmm. Especially with a bunch of local elections and judicial elections. It's just kind of crazy to remember all of that. So feel free to prepare your ballot ahead of time. And then you can just, look on your sample ballot and transcribe it over to the ballot the election judges give you. And that's a really, really good way, especially due to memory issues that often accompany TBI. It's a good way to feel like you're prepared, you know who to vote for, and you don't have to sit there and remember things that are maybe complicated and complex. So that's another really good way to make voting more accessible.
What about, Molly, having it pulled up on your phone or tablet?
I don't believe that that's explicitly disallowed. I think you may be more likely to get challenged on it. I don't think they want you to have communications technology in the voting booth. That being said, they're often screened in private. So who would know? Right. If you have the opportunity to jot it down on a piece of paper or to print it out, that's preferable.
Yeah. Or take screenshots and print them.
Exactly.
Yep.
Exactly. Cool.
Yeah, so that's kind of the gist of it. And if you have specific questions about your state, or you want to have any sort of information about where to go to find out more information about any of this, feel free to drop a comment or shoot us an email. Our information's on the bottom of that sheet. But just sort of in closing, it's something they have to keep in mind is that voting is an act of advocacy, but during voting, you're going to have to be a self-advocate as a person with a disability. And self-advocacy is different in that political advocacy, meaning that we talked about this in that first webinar, political advocacy being more systems-based and personal advocacy being for you and that self aspect of it. And as someone with an invisible disability, as most folks with TBI are, it's going to be a challenge in some places to get the accommodations that you are entitled to. So staying firm, you are entitled to accommodations with this disability. You are entitled to vote, and no one can stop you from any of that. You don't have, there's in no place does it say you have to prove that you have a disability to have the accommodations that anybody can use. Nobody would have to prove that they have a disability to use a ramp at an entrance to a building. So that's just something to keep in mind, is that, stay calm and stay strong, but you are entitled to use the voting accommodations that your state and county allow. And just if there anything that happens, make sure to call your Secretary of State's office if anything discriminatory does happen. They will be the ones that would be able to follow up and take care of it. All of their phone numbers will be online. And if you need help with that after the election, if you want to contact us on November 7th and say this happened, or even on November 6th and say this is happening, our emails are right at the bottom of that page. Feel free to give us a contact and we will do our best to help you where we can and point you in the right direction for who will be able to help solve your problems. But it's just important to remember when you're at the poll, you're entitled to a vote and do your best to cast it.
Right. And one of the reasons we bring this up is that sometimes election judges don't quite know exactly how all of these laws work. They're not disability experts. A lot of times they're volunteers. And so it doesn't come from a place of discrimination necessarily. It comes from a place of ignorance. And so one of the things that we found is helpful is arming our advocates with the tools to make sure that the election judges know that this is legally mandated. This isn't a choice. And so if you bring this sheet with you when you're voting and your election judge is like, well, we don't have an accessible voting machine. Our kind of information is on there, like give us a call, we can talk to them because they're legally required to have that kind of technology available so that people can vote independently and confidentially, and that's really important. So you may have to stick up for yourself. Hopefully you don't. Hopefully they're just like, yeah, of course, here's how it works. But we just want to make sure that you all are prepared in the case that an election judge doesn't quite know how disability voting works, because unfortunately we've stumbled across that before. So, oh, go ahead.
And you mentioned if anyone has any trouble, they can contact the Secretary of State's office.
Yep.
One thing I'd like you guys to kind of help clear up, I hear it in the group often, report it to the ADA. What's wrong with that statement?
The ADA is a body.
It's an act.
Yes.
It's a lot. It's not a group.
Right.
So just in general, if people have any disability accommodation problems, would it be the Secretary of State's office that they would contact? Not just in relation to voting, but would it always be the Secretary of State's office?
No, the Secretary of State's office is specific to voting in particular. The Secretary of State is the one who oversees all voting procedures and processes. Unfortunately, the ADA isn't the only comprehensive law, and so the Secretary of State also juggles like the Help America Vote Act. There are a couple of other acts that they work with, but the ADA is actually enforced through a different mechanism more generally when it doesn't relate to voting.
And we should be clear, the Secretary of State's office in your state, not the federal level Secretary of State, who's the chief diplomat, Secretary of State, that is sort of the chief elections officer in your state.
Right. So like in Minnesota, that's Steve Simon.
Yeah. So, with what Molly said.
Yeah, sounds good. So I think there is an official, I think if I'm remembering correctly, there's an official place for you to submit like complaints about ADA violations. I think a lot of times it does go through the state, but we'll have to get back to you on the specific body that goes through, because that can be a complicated process since it often commingles with like legal requirements and stuff like that.
Molly, at the beginning of this year's Citizens Advocates, I can't remember if you were there yet or not. We had a meeting, or not a meeting, but it was put on by the group Cheryl works with.
MNCCD, the Consortium for Citizens with
Disabilities. Yes, it was put on by them. And we sat in and listened to, I want to say he was an attorney something. His name was like Leslie. Am I jogging anything here with you?
I'm not sure.
Oh, he was
he like disability in general? Was he like a disability lawyer, or did he do other forms?
No. He's an attorney something for the state.
Oh, okay.
Not like attorney general. I can't remember, but he specifically told us to report anything to the specific group, and I'm not at all helping. But they said that they are absolutely required to investigate every single complaint.
Yeah.
Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah. I just don't know the organization off the top of my head. We can track down a website link.
And it was driving me crazy because I
Yeah.
can visualize the conversation, but I can't remember the details.
Yeah, if you are in Minnesota, a good place to go through is the Disability Law Center. I knew they do a lot of interfacing with ADA complaints, but that is Minnesota specific.
Right. Okay, so neither of you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I wasn't there yet.
It's a complicated.
Yeah, I know you weren't there yet. But it was like Health and Human Services. It was some specific thing that you can go to, and they're required to
Gotcha.
investigate any complaints. And I know I have a friend out in Virginia who has had to, unfortunately, her service dog keeps getting denied when she gets Lyft or Uber. It was Uber. And that's a really huge growing problem, as they're denying dogs in their Lyfts, and it's illegal. So
it is.
All right. Well, anything else, you guys, regarding the accommodations for voting? There was something you guys said that I wanted to make sure I reiterate it, and I can't remember what it was. Oh, I know, the curbside voting. You know, that could be for any, like, if you're having some serious anxiety that day, you can request the curbside voting if you don't think you can go in, if it looks like it's a huge crowd. So how would they find the way to contact the election judge to come out to the car?
Yeah, so, and this is the problem, because the way legally it's written is they're mandated to have a sign near the entrance where you would be curbside voting that has some form of communication with the election judges inside. And what they specifically listed as an example was a doorbell. So you
still have to get out of your car to push the doorbell.
And contact in some sort of way. Fortunately, a lot of times people who are curbside voting have drivers, and they can hop out and push the doorbell. But that is kind of an error in it, and it's not going to be consistent across every polling place. The other thing is that curbside voting is not required at every single polling place across the country. It's only mandated when they don't have a ramp, an accessible parking space, an elevator, stuff like that. So while it's often an opportunity that like a polling place can have to increase their accessibility, they're not legally required to offer that service unless they're lacking in some other area.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And I think the biggest thing is being able to bring your sample ballot or your notes or whatever it is, because like you said, there's so many different things on the ballot. It's hard to remember it all. So definitely remember that you can bring that with you. And is there a way to find, like, I found my exact local ballot, because each ballot will be different depending if you're voting for some of your local people too. So what would be the best way to find that?
So
are there some specific Google terms or?
If you're in Minnesota, it'll be mnvotes.org. You can find your sample ballot there. And actually, that's going to be one of the topics for the upcoming weeks here when we do candidate researching in a few weeks. But generally speaking, it's going to be your Secretary of State's website. And we can go through a more specific walkthrough on how to get there in the coming weeks.
Yeah. So one way, if you can't wait and you want to do all of your research now, which half my heart if that's you, is to just Google your state sample ballot, because a lot of times that'll just automatically direct you to the Secretary of State's website of whatever state you're in and the right place to find it. So that's just kind of a quick and easy way. We'll have more links on the next webinar as well, though, with a little bit more detail depending on what state you're in.
Perfect. All right. And then next week, we have another webinar on the 24th talking about healthcare and disability rights. And then we've moved it to the 2nd, the candidate research webinar, which is what you were kind of just talking about. So, and all of these replays are getting posted on the Faces of TBI webpage as well. So you guys can check them out if you haven't caught the first two. This is our third in the series. So they've all been very informative and very helpful. So thank you both so much for being here and sharing all this with everyone, because it's really, really important that we vote. You know, it is your right as a citizen to be able to vote. So thank you guys for doing this.
Well, thanks for having us.
No problem, especially after such a long trip and you must be tired.
Yes, I got back last night, so I had to keep remembering what day it was because I still think it's Sunday. I don't know.
Yeah.
Anyway, well, thank you so
Awesome.
much for having us and letting us have a chance to talk to some more folks with brain injury about, you know, how to get involved and how to make sure that their votes are counting.
Awesome. All right. Thank you guys.
Bye. Thank you so much.